Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for starting your Monday with this, or wherever you are in the world. My name is Jason Buffington. Dave Russell is off this week, but if we bring up the map, you can still see that I am claiming from the great state of Texas. Also, already on the call from today, our producer is in Georgia within the United States. Love the fact that actually we already got a hi from India. I love it when y'all join before we do, which is fantastic. Also, our social media is out of Romania, and if I squint just a little bit, there's that tiny little green dot, which some people would call the state of Massachusetts. If you're from Texas, it's all relative in size. But we've got someone representing from the Boston area ish today. Please welcome Chris Hoff. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Jason, how you doing today?
Every Monday is a good day, right?
Absolutely.
So for the folks at home, while Dave and I pretend to know a lot about a lot of different kind of concepts, Chris Hoff really is the author of Veeam's strategy when it comes to where do we fit as a security company? How does backup fit within a ransomware strategy or a ransomware mitigation strategy? Chris, you want to do a quick bio?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've spent the past about 20 years in cybersecurity in various roles. So mostly focused on in the malware space. So the evolution of what used to be viruses that's turned into ransomware is kind of my ballywick over here.
Nice. All right. Well, it turns out that in 2022, it's hard to have any kind of IT conversation without talking about cyber events and ransomware in particular. And I think it's really interesting that when we talk to the traditional Veeam audiences, those folks that are designing and managing data protection solutions, that in almost all cases, it's not about just operational recovery. It's not about BCDR. For almost all of them, their primary design criteria is how do we get better at being prepared to mitigate against a ransomware type event? For those that have been following the live streams for the last several months, so we have been using data from our data protection trends report for 2022. Came out in February, so let's walk a little bit of data from that. And Chris, one of the first slides to kind of walk through. Sorry about that, mouse got a little ahead of me. So when organizations were asked, and this is 3,400 responses, this is the largest independent research project published in the data protection space. And the question was asked is, what does modern mean when we talk about data protection, right? What does a modern or innovative approach to data protection look like? And as usual, the long lines are choose all that apply. The short lines is when you look at what's most important, what could that look like? Now, there's a lot of things in this list. Dave and I have actually covered a majority of them over time, but I want to draw folks' eye to the center. We'll really talk about, it seems like integratability is top of mind for a lot of folks, and that includes both API and having backup be part of a broader system management ecosystem. But Chris, third on the list, right? The only things that seem more interesting when it comes to modern data protection is that we need to recognize that hybrid and multi-cloud is a current state, not a future state. But number 3 on that list, 37% of orgs say the ability to integrate data protection is part of a cyber strategy. 13%, so 1 out of 8 orgs say it's the most important consideration along the way. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's about time, quite honestly. Ransomware in particular has essentially democratized data theft. And what I mean by that is
Okay.
in kind of the good old days, you as a victim had to have something that the attacker wanted or could monetize, right? You know, whether it's credit card numbers or PII or what have you. Ransomware has kind of flipped that around so that the data that's being stolen or taken away from you only has to be valuable to you and valuable enough to you in order to pay money to get it back. And so the recovery method or the remediation method for a ransomware attack is now recovering from backup. So it's absolutely pulled in the traditional backup and recovery teams into the overall security strategy.
Okay. So we've got a lot of excitement on this particular topic. It's hard not to really want to focus and be passionate on how do you remediate against that. Before we move on with the data, though, we actually let's see. Do we have a map entry yet? We do. Okay, good. So let's take a look at the map because a lot of folks are piling on. And by the way, I have to tell you, I've been in the data protection space for 31 years. I've been at Veeam for the last 4. There are very few Chris Hoffs in the world. If you have questions about how this stuff really comes to reality, Chris is the guy. Mr. Hoff is how he prefers to be addressed. So please, along with piling on for where you are in the world, throw those questions in. Let's make sure this really is actionable for you today. But if we take a look in the U.S., let's take a look here. So Iowa, my birth state, welcome. New Mexico's in the house. Texas is already representing. And we got some Arizona going on. North Carolina on the side? We see Ohio. So U.S. is really piling on as well. I think that's New Jersey in that little bend. So that's awesome. So thanks for that. Let's take a look at Europe. We have Netherlands in the house. Czech. Some amazing food in Czech. Armenia. We got France, Germany, Spain. Europe is well lit this morning. Chris, you got people wanting to talk to you all over the place. Brazil, everything is better in the world when Brazil checks in green because they have just such a huge amount of real estate, and they also know what to do with meat and wine. And then lastly, let's see, we got South Africa, speaking of meat and wine. And then I see Iran and India. Wow, that whole peninsula in the Gulf is lit up thinking about ransomware. So Chris, you have some fans. We should prepare for some questions along the way. But I want to double down on something that you mentioned earlier is when you talk about it's about time that cyber and backup have a conversation. One of the questions that was new in our survey this year that, frankly, I was a little surprised by, so I grew up in the backup world. You grew up in the cyber world. And, our predecessors never talked to each other. Right. They were on different floors, in different teams, on way different budgets along the way. This was our first year in several years to ask the question, how aligned is your organization's strategy around cybersecurity versus the organization's strategy around BCDR? And the banner cry from our mutual good friend, Melissa Palmer, is ransomware is a disaster. And in fact, if you're piling on the notes today, put that in a hashtag, right? Ransomware is a disaster. But Chris, I was surprised to see 88%, so let's call that 7 out of 8 orgs, would tell you that their two strategies are aligned. 40%, 2 and 5 organizations would say they have a single strategy that encompasses both cyber events and natural disasters. And then 48%, nearly half, would say those strategies are mostly integrated. I think this is good news. What are your thoughts?
I think it's fantastic news. And even better is that the BCDR folks are being brought into things like tabletop exercises in the cyber world where it was just kind of assumed that, oh yeah, well, Jason's gonna recover the data once we figure out what needs to be recovered. They're actually being brought in to prove that they can essentially do their job, right, and do it in a way that is going to help the business. So I love the fact that this number is growing, and even more so, it's not dependent on what I like to call the security maturity of an organization. It's SMBs all the way up through the largest enterprise are taking this approach.
Yeah, and one of the things that we preach on an awful lot, in fact, Melissa Palmer is going to be on with us next week. We're going to talk about business continuity and disaster recovery. We talk about disaster recovery for a lot of folks. That really does come down mostly to resuming operational functionality of IT dependent services, right? But when you talk about business continuity, you really are talking about anything that disrupts the core operations of the business, of which IT is only one area. So I love the fact that, look, cyber impacts the production process, right? Fire, flood impacts the production process. So I love the fact that in many ways we're looking at all of those as just simply potential interruptions that we have to mitigate and persevere and manage around, right? Now, of course, there is one really radical difference, and that is that if your data center is underwater, if it's under earth, if it's on fire, all those natural disasters that we've talked about for years, your goal is to take the most immediate recent copy that you can and bring that up online as quickly as possible. Chris, I'm going to guess that's exactly not the copy that you want to bring up in a cyber event.
Absolutely not. And part of the incident response process is figuring out which copy of the data you want to restore, right? So when did the threat get in? How far did it spread? What did it impact? And that's going to be the thing that's going to tell you where and when you need to recover.
There is one other contrast that's probably worth really noting, and that is that for many organizations, when we talk about things like fire and flood, it's an if consideration, right? You don't have a flood every year, you don't have a fire every year, you don't have an earthquake every year, right? But one of the questions that was asked, and this one just the technical term is scared the bejeebies out of me. But when organizations were asked, so this is 3,300 organizations, unbiased, not Veeam customers. I guess statistically, what, 12, 13%, whatever market share is, were Veeam customers, but it was an unbiased sample. And when those organizations were asked, how often have you been hit by ransomware? Two things that I thought were really interesting on this. The first one, let's hear your reaction on this. 24%, maybe I should say only 24%, 1 out of 4 organizations said they had not been hit. And when you and I have talked about this offline, that number is probably even optimistically high.
Yes, I would say that 24% of these organizations don't know if they've been hit, or quite honestly, they've gotten lucky and their defensive technologies, right, their next gen firewalls, their AV, et cetera, have actually blocked it. So I would say that even those 24 that haven't been hit yet.
So, and one thing that you shared with folks on other calls that I thought was really interesting was you talked about how that for a lot of cyber attacks, there is a gestation period that can happen over, several hundred days. And so it might be that of those 24%, that a significant number of them, they're still in gestation. The actors are still working their way through the environment. They just haven't struck yet. Is that a fair way to call that?
That's absolutely true. The mean time to detection is still somewhere around 200 days. I actually have to look it up for 2021, but it's still around 200 days. So that's 200 days of almost a year that a bad actor is either physically or programmatically in your network, and you don't know about it.
That's crazy.
And what organizations are starting to see is that the programmatic part, right, is more of a remote access Trojan where it's giving access to the actual human who's got eyes on glass and is now poking around inside your network.
Okay, so let's share some more bad news. So the orange bar says that best case, 1 out of 4 organizations have not been hit yet. Many of them are probably just unaware. But if you add the 24% and the 16, you get 40, which means I'm lazy, so you can invert the rest and say it's 60% or more have had more than one attack. Now, I call this the ATM model. You just call this the neighborhood bully. Walk us through what you mean by that.
So if you think about a ransomware attack or any kind of cyber event as having a goal of making money, which is what they want to do, right? It's a $20 billion industry at this point, from the bad guys' perspective. The reality is that they're looking at it from an ROI perspective. And so if you get hit with a ransomware attack and you pay the ransom, you've just become their customer, and it's easier to get a customer to buy again than it is to go get a new customer. So they're going to come back at you. Or to use my bully analogy, if the school bully comes up to you and takes your lunch money and you give it to them, they know that you're an easy target, so they're going to come back again. They're going to keep hitting you until the well runs dry, until you don't have any more lunch money. And then they're probably going to do something that's pretty destructive as retribution for you not being able to fund their lunch. So I would say that any of these folks, the 19% who have had three ransomware attacks, the 9, 5, and 9% and 5% that have had 4 and 5% or 4 and 5 attacks, these are the folks who are just going to see consistent breaches inside their networks because they've shown that they're willing to pay.
Sure.
Which it stinks, right? Because the mantra is don't pay the ransom. But as we're going to get into, I'm sure, the idea of not paying the ransom is actually very hard to live up to.
So let's kind of look through, go a little bit further on this, right? So this was the frequency of the attacks, and Terrence brought up a question, but I want to actually walk through one more slide on causality before we double down on his response along the way, and that is looking at where did it come from. Right. So one of the data points that we didn't show in this data is when organizations were asked around most common attacks, 51% of organizations said they had at least one outage that was caused by ransomware. For 2 years in a row, the most impactful outage of the year was not servers breaking, it was not fire flood, it was a cyber event along the way. And so we thought it'd be interesting, as we've asked for the last several years, is trying to understand where is this stuff coming from. Chris, it's coming from the same spaces it's always come from. That's got to drive you crazy.
Yes. Spam has and this kind of is an interesting chart to me because spam has been the number one attack vector for about 20 years. The differences are that the spam has moved away from having a malicious attachment to having a link that you click on or just having code embedded in the email itself. The frustrating statistic on here are the 23% of attacks that were caused by a credential compromise. That to me says that you're not using multi-factor authentication, you're reusing passwords, or the organization is not supplying their users with a way to manage their passwords, which is a pretty simple fix.
Yeah, well, I got to tell you, so I feel pretty good about my chances because I always had 1, 2, 3 after using password as my password, and that way no one can guess because it's not just a word. So thankfully, I'm probably immune to that, but I can see how other people's credentials might get compromised.
Absolutely, just throw an exclamation point on there, and you'll be fine. It'll be great.
Well, yeah,
I'm kidding.
Yeah, me too. All right. But Terrence does bring up an interesting question. So certainly the first part of the question was, what's the counter response then? And then the second part, I think there's actually two questions. Does the war elevate threats possibility? So I'm going to answer the latter part. And then ask you to chime in on the counter response. I would tell you that any time that there is a global phenomenon going on, that it distracts people, right? And so you'll find less diligence because we're dealing with other stuff, right? A lot of us have coworkers that are radically and locally affected. And so we're more distracting. And oh, by the way, there's a special place in hell for bad actors who send out emails saying, please fund this relief fund or this humanitarian effort during times like this. For those folks, there is a special place in hell. But those kinds of efforts will radically improve the attack surface on that. But Chris, you also mentioned that during times like this, that you can actually deliver basically ransomware as a service. Seems like it's more scalable than it's ever been before, too, right?
Absolutely, and so there's actually some interesting data on what's happening with global incidents right now. And the pandemic obviously brought brought a lot of new
Sure.
scams and whatnot to light. But um, the the war in Ukraine is actually changing the dynamic a little bit for attackers, because the attackers are now being cut off from internet access because of where a majority of them come from.
Hmm.
Um, do with that information as you will. But from a from the overall attack perspective, we're seeing more and more folks who are using the global upheaval in order to, like you said, fund their campaigns and put money in their own pockets.
Right. So let's go double the map back a little bit more. We are seeing a few more folks pile on along the way. Let's see. How about we take a look at Europe first? So it looks like we got Poland's in the house. The boot, Italy is in. So if we go back to the New World, Mexico, my neighbors to the south, have weighed in this morning. So Buenos Dias this morning. And then there's a little bitty green dot called Singapore. Some of my favorite memories are of multiple trips to Singapore over the years. So thank you all for joining as well. All right. So the other part of Terrence's question, and please keep weighing in along the way. Also ask your questions as well. Let me answer the other part of Terrence's question, because we're talking about what are the right responses now. Chris, when we talk about why is backup part of, or should be part of, a cyber strategy, maybe this next data point can kind of draw an eye to it. So in the same survey report, organizations were asked, thinking about the most significant ransomware attack in the last 12 months, so 2021, what percentage of your data were you able to recover? Now, there was some additional instruction context when this question was asked around, this was, you paid the ransom or not, you pulled your tapes back or not. I mean, for all those heroics, at the end of the day, when it was all said and done, and you called the event over, how much of your data were you able to have gotten back? And the average is 64%. Right? On average, when everything is said and done, you will have lost a third of your data. This, to me, I mean, for folks at home, take a screenshot. Right. I mean, this is ugly. I would also point out to you, by the way, if you don't want a screenshot, then go to the URL on the very bottom of the screen where it says VEE.am/DPR22. Go download the full report, share it. If you're a backup person, share it with your security friend. If you're a security person, share it with your backup admin. But this is really scary. And I think the first time I saw this, Chris, you and I used to argue about Veeam is a backup company. Does that mean that we are a security company also?
I maintain that backup is part of your data security program, because we're not an active defense. We're not a next gen firewall, right? We're not an IPS, that type of thing. But when, like I said earlier, when the bad stuff happens, the best practices are now telling us to restore from backup. And what this data is telling me is that we may not be as prepared as we think we are for that recovery process. And we've talked about it before, that this data can be lost multiple ways, right? It could be lost because it wasn't actually backed up. You didn't verify your backups
Sure.
to prove that that the data was recoverable. It could be that the bad actors have infiltrated your backup infrastructure and started deleting data on their own. It could be because that data was backed up, encrypted, and you don't actually have a clean copy of that data. And so this, to me, really speaks more about preparation for that you said inevitable attack.
Yeah. Yeah.
Than anything else.
Yeah. So, the question I gave you was a little bit loaded, right? So we are not a cyber company from the sake of prevention. But what I think the data is showing us is that if we are not part of this of a cyber strategy from a remediation perspective, I think the technical term is you're screwed. I mean, backup has to be part of the equation. But Chris, some of the things that you talked about were so germane in this conversation, right? How do you know that everything is getting backed up? How are you verifying that that you actually have repositories that are protected against ransomware, right? For as long as ransomware has been out there, one of the key plays has been kill the backups, right? Because there's a much better chance that you're going to pay if you don't have the backups to go back to. Right. So this is where immutability and air gapping comes in so important along the way. And oh, by the way, and I love what you said here. How do you make sure that what's in the backup repository is actually clean?
Yep. And the analogy I like to use is kind of a water bottle analogy. I've got my water bottle right here. It is solid. It's going to contain the liquid that's in it. So
Totally.
it is immutable.
Yep.
But can I prove that the liquid inside is safe to consume? Is this water or is it gasoline? Is it poison? And so the question that we need to ask when it comes to backup is, are we backing up clean data, or are we backing up the malware, or conversely, are we backing up something that has been tampered with by a bad actor?
Yep.
And so that type of verification is going to directly link us to this recoverability. And I think actually Terrence, correct me if I'm wrong, Terrence asked about what the answer is to not paying the ransom. And I think I might have jumped over his piece of the question there, but the other piece of that answer is, other than making sure that you verified that your data is actually there, is the speed in which that you can recover. Because a lot of organizations, I know we're jumping back, but a lot of organizations are choosing to pay the ransom as a stopgap because they know that their backups can't be recovered as quickly as they need them to.
That's a key goal. Absolutely. Yeah. When you think about,
we call it out in the DPR too.
We do. So looking at time of remediation is a big deal. So I one of the questions I asked you at the very beginning was, there's a difference. There's one of the key differences between ransomware as a disaster versus a natural occurring disaster is, in a natural occurring disaster, we assume that the most current survivable data is valid. And so how quickly can you get it up from a data center that's not on fire, underwater, under earth, blown away, whatever? We know that that's exactly not the copy that you want in a cyber event. However, I would argue that there's the deterministic question of we need to do something. And then there's all the rest of the processes for traditional BCDR, which is, how do I stand up secondary infrastructure? How do I get the data up as quickly as possible? How do I get the users reconnected? All those steps still hold true. There's just this detour after step one. And the detour says, go identify what you know to be clean data. And then once you have clean data, then you're right back to how quickly can I get the rest of the environment up. That's actually a good segue into what we're going to be covering next week. This time next week, Melissa Palmer and I will be talking about the other disasters besides ransomware and what the DPR data shows for that. But there's also two other live streams between now and then. So on Wednesday this week, April 5th, Corinne and Edward will be doing a live from event from Microsoft 365 event. It is an hour later than normal. We normally go at noon East Coast US. They are at 1 p.m., so an hour later than normal. They'll be talking about Microsoft 365 and some of the new additions there, probably with version 6. On Friday at our regularly scheduled time, so we see another live event. Rick and Kirsten are going to be doing another live session for the technology folks in the house. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be back next Monday to talk about BCDR because we know ransomware is a disaster. Chris, you get 30 seconds left. Last words. What do you, when you're talking to CISOs and backup admins, what do you wish they would hear?
So, funny you should ask. The number one thing that I get from our support folks is they wish that organizations would use the 3-2-1 rule for data backup. Um, every every organization that they talk to that is not using that rule and not having a copy of their data off-site or mutable and air-gapped is a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
For these types of things. So if there's one thing that we can help organizations with, it's follow those best practices.
Fair enough. All right. That's the last word, and I couldn't say any better than that. So, Chris, thanks for joining this week. For everyone out there on the 3 platforms, keep the questions coming in. We will try to answer as many as we can through chat after the fact throughout the day today. And again, thanks for watching. Have a good week.